Ladies and gentlemen, let's Red Game Silicon video. We're going to start a discussion on the Xbox One's architecture again. Now, some of the architects behind the Xbox One have started to speak out, and this has all arisen because Albert Penello went onto a couple of forums, for example NeoGAF, and started to talk and try to defend the Xbox One versus the PlayStation 4, of course. And people pretty much tore him apart. Then he went back and tried to explain further by getting information from technical fellows, as Microsoft called them, and people once again tore him apart. So Microsoft decided not to respond anymore on NeoGAF and indeed other forums. Instead, they decided to have an interview with Eurogamer, and Eurogamer have had a rather in-depth discussion with Microsoft. The problem is, people are once again starting to tear it apart. Can you sense a pattern here? So what we're going to be doing, we're going to be discussing this quite in depth, because there's a lot of parts to this actually. They give you a lot of information of how the system is put together, and it's not going to be quick to go into this. So people have already started to ask me on various methods such as YouTube messaging and of course Facebook what my thoughts are on this, and so we're going to be trying to tear into this a little bit. So the first thing we're going to of course say is that Microsoft themselves are pretty happy and proud of the design, at least that's what they're saying. So I'm going to be doing some analysis as I go through the interview, and then I'm going to be doing a final analysis towards the end. I'm also going to be talking about my thoughts in terms of some of the decisions as well. I have no idea how many videos this is going to turn into, but regardless. Anyway, Microsoft say they're very proud of their design, and then they say that we think we have very good balance, very good performance. We have a product that can handle other things other than just raw ALU, GPU compute power in other words. There are quite a number of other design aspects and requirements to be put around things like latency, steady frame rates, and the titles aren't interrupted by the system and things like that. You'll see this very much as a pervasive, ongoing thing in our system design. Right, I'm going to hold and keep you right there just for a moment. Okay, so not really sure what they're talking about with latency at this point. I've done a video on Gddr5 latency versus DDR3. Yes, there is a small amount of extra latency, but when we're talking small, we're talking like a nanosecond or two. You can check the video out if you so wish. I've also done an article on redgamingtech.com, and it goes into a lot of that, and of course, once again, all the stuff is very easy to reverse engineer. We've given you the facts and figures so you can do it yourselves. Anyway, Microsoft are keen to try to clear up two main elements. One, the DDR3 fiasco, and two, the CUs, the compute units, the GCN cores. Now, let's start with the Gddr5. I think that's a good place to start with, don't you? So anyway, Microsoft on this say, in regards to Gddr5, that having ESRAM costs very little power and has opportunity to give you very high memory bandwidth. You can reduce the bandwidth on external memory. That saves a lot of power consumption, and commodity memory is cheap as well, commodity memory being DDR3, so you can afford more. That's really the driving force behind that. So if you want a high memory capability, relatively low power, and a lot of bandwidth, I'm sorry guys, my water bottle just decided to crack, and a lot of bandwidth, there are not many ways of solving that. Okay, so before we go really into the in-depth workings of this, let's give my initial thoughts. I have a couple of concerns immediately for this. There's a couple of things I have an issue with in that statement. The first is that, yes, DDR3 memory is cheaper, so, it costs you less. That's great and all, but he's saying that means you can have more memory. That didn't really work out well, did it? Both systems have 8 gigs, and obviously we can't really count 32 megabytes of ESRAM. I mean, okay, it's 32 megs, but what's that really going to do in terms of development? As in, it's not exactly huge amounts to fit tons of games code in. Second issue I have is that the power requirement. Now, as far as I'm reading, and I'm still going to be doing more on this, so, don't shoot me in flames if I'm 100% wrong, but from what I'm reading, and my initial findings, Gddr5 memory doesn't actually require that much more power. Now, what it could be, maybe, is possibly the memory controllers or something. Maybe they're factoring in something else. But I'm pretty sure that GDDR5 memory runs at slightly lower voltages than DDR3. So I'm not exactly sure what Microsoft are talking about there, especially when you start factoring in the extra power requirements for the APU as well. So I'm not really sure exactly where they're going with that. Anyway, let's continue forward. You can think of the ESRAM, and DDR3 is making up 8 total memory controllers. So there are 4 external memory controllers, which are 64-bit, which go on DDR3, and there are 4 internal memory controllers, which are 256 that go to ESRAM. These are all connected via a crossbar, and so in fact will be true. They could directly simultaneously to DRAM and ESRAM. And furthermore, he said that he's very surprised about the controversy regarding the memory. He said, "This controversy is rather surprising to me, especially when you view the ESRAM as evolution of EDRAM, the Xbox 360. No one questions on the Xbox 360 whether the EDRAM bandwidth coherent with the bandwidth coming out of the system memory. In fact, the system was designed to require it. We had to pull over our vertex buffers and our textures out of the system memory concurrent with what's going on with rendered targets, color, depth, stencil buffers that were EDRAM. Of course, with Xbox One, we're going with a design where ESRAM has the same natural extensions with what we had in EDRAM on Xbox 360, to which you're going to be going coherently. It's a nice evolution on Xbox 360 in that we can clean up a lot of the limitations that we had with EDRAM. The Xbox 360 was the easiest console platform to develop for. That's actually very true. Out of quote, is considerably easier than the PlayStation 3. Back into quote. And it wasn't that hard for our developers to adapt to EDRAM. But there were a number of places where we said, gosh, it wouldn't it be nice the entire render target didn't have to live in EDRAM. So we fixed that with Xbox One with the ability to overflow into ESRAM, into DDR3. So the ESRAM is fully integrated into our page table, so you can have kind of mix and match the ESRAM and DDR3 as you go. From our perspective, it's much of an evolution and an improvement, a big improvement over the design we had in Xbox 360. I'm kind of surprised by all of this, frankly. Furthermore, they said, and you could even make it so portions of your render targets that have very little overdraw. For example, if you're doing a racing game and the sky has very little overdraw, you could stick those subsets and resources into DDR3 to improve the ESRAM utilizations. On the GPU, we've added compressed render target formats like 6E4 and 7E3 HDR float formats that were very, very popular on Xbox 360, which instead of doing 16-bit floats per component, 64 BPP render targets, were equivalent of doing only 32 bits, where it did a lot of focus on really maximizing efficiency and utilization of that ESRAM. So if people don't exactly understand what the hell they're talking about, just in case you're a bit curious, basically they're saying that you can, of course, put certain assets into both DDR3 and the ESRAM. That's fine. So, for example, let's assume that you're, as they are saying, using a racing game, and your sky has very little overdraw. You could stick those subsets of your resources into DDR3 to improve ESRAM utilization. What they're basically saying is that rather than wasting that space, rather than filling up the ESRAM with stuff that's not relevant, you can instead put that into DDR3. And of course, DDR3 is a lot more plentiful, they have plenty of it, and so you're not going to be wasting that very small amount of memory. I understand that, and I like that you can do it. I understand that Microsoft might be a bit confused with why people are a bit annoyed with the choice of DDR3, but I think I can answer this very simply. The thing is, with the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3, when they were released, graphics memory wasn't up to the performance it is now. Look at the flop performance of Xbox 360. You're talking about 250-ish G-flops, right? Which is, it's about a fifth, a sixth of what the Xbox One can do. just to give you an example. And so, okay, we understand that you've made ESRAM a lot more efficient, but people are saying, okay, well, that's nice, but you can't judge something based upon something that was like 4, 5, 6, 7 years ago. Even 2 years ago is not really a good way to judge something in terms of tech, but when we're talking 5 years plus, it's not really a good benchmark. So people are saying, well, okay, here's the argument. You're saying that you can put all of that overdraw, you could put assets that aren't really required, you can do all of that, and you have the coherent memory bandwidth and so on, but here's Sony's counter-argument. Gddr5. In other words, from the perspective of me as a gamer, I probably won't care, right? If I'm playing a game and I'm hurtling along a racetrack, or I'm, beating someone to a pulp on Killer Instinct or whatever, at that point, it doesn't matter to me where the hell the textures are stored, what's going on with the render targets, what the performance is of a graphics system. But the problem is, for the developers, it will, and I can see this being a bit of a pain in the butt, because it's going to mean that they're going to have to do a lot of shifting of data, and I can see this being a lot of manual work. Okay, so Microsoft, let's leave them with that just for a moment, and let's start to talk about the speed, right, of the ESRAM. Many will remember the massive controversy regarding this. Now, it started off with the Xbox One initially. The rumours were that it could do 102 gigabytes per second. And then the rumours come to 204. Then people started to say, okay, well, now the graphics GPU, of course, has increased in clock speed, and then it went to 109 gigabytes per second. But the double rate, because it can read and write, that's remained at 204. And people were scratching their head, because 109 plus 109 doesn't equal 204. And so people were like, well, what's going on? Are you talking about efficiency? Are you forgetting to add something here? Are you making a mistake? Is there something that you're not telling us, or what's going on? So anyway, I'm going to read out a quote. When we started, we wrote a spec. Before we really went into any implementation details, we had to give developers something to plan around before we had the silicon, before we even was running in simulation, before taped out, and said that the minimum bandwidth we want from the ESRAM is 102 gigabytes per second. And so with the GPU clock speed increase, that went to 109. In the end, once you get into implementing this, the logic turned out that we could go much higher. There are 4 8 megabyte lanes, but these are not contiguous 8 megabyte chunks of memory with each of those lanes. Each lane, that 8 megabytes, is broken down into 8 modules, and this should address whether you can really read and write memory bandwidth. Read and write bandwidth in memory simultaneously. Yes, you can. There are actually a lot of individual blocks that comprise the whole ESRAM, so you can talk to those in parallel. Of course, if you're hitting the same area over and over and over again, you don't get to spread out your bandwidth, and so that's one of the reasons why in real testing you get between 140 and 150 gigabytes per second, rather than the peak of 204. It's not just 4 chunks of 8 megabytes of RAM. It's actually a lot more complicated than that, and depends on how the pattern you get to use those simultaneously. That lets you do read and write simultaneously. You do get to add the read and write bandwidths as well as adding the read and write bandwidths to the main memory. That's just one of the misconceptions we wanted to clean up. If you're only doing read, you're capped at 109. If you're only doing writes, you're capped at 109. To get over that, you need to have a mix of read and writes, but when you are going to look at things, they are typically in ESRAM, such as your render targets and depth buffers. Intrinsically, they have a lot of read modified rates going on, as in the blends and depth buffer updates. Those are natural things to stick in ESRAM and natural things to take advantage of concurrent read/writes. Okay. So we get some information now. Okay, that makes sense. So if you are doing the things that the ESRAM is supposed to let you do, then you're looking at about 140 to 150 gigabytes per second. That's okay. So Microsoft are very keen to point out that if you are familiar already with the EDRAM setup of the Xbox 360, which many developers would be at this point, then you're going to be naturally used to the ESRAM. I have a few problems with that though. It's just not as much as, say, the PlayStation 4 in terms of pure memory. Now, I understand that they are saying that you can do a lot with this ESRAM, and we're going to be doing some analysis on this in just a moment. I think many people are already a bit confused. Now, obviously, Microsoft does have some things such as tiled resources, which we'll go into later on, and we're going to go into some other extensions and API stuff, but we're trying to blast through the article, and then I'm going to give my thoughts and opinions in probably the second video, because it's already turning pretty lengthy as is. Microsoft did say that they're based on the Sea Island family. We've made quite a number of changes in different parts of the areas. The biggest thing, in terms of the number of compute units, is something that's been very easy to focus on. It's like saying, hey, let's count up the number of CUs, count up the gigaflops, and declare the winner based on that. My take on it is, when you buy a graphics card, do you go by specs, or do you actually run some benchmarks? Firstly, though, we don't have any games out. You can't just see the games. When you see games, you'll be saying, oh, what performance difference is between them? The games are the benchmarks. We had opportunity with Xbox One to go out and check a lot of our balance. The balance is really the key to making good performance on a game's console. You don't want any bottlenecks being the main bottleneck that slows you down. I've got a couple of small issues with that statement. Okay, do you look at the specs? Well, yeah, initially I do actually, because that's kind of like saying, well, that doesn't even make sense. It's like, the lower specs are, obviously it's not going to perform so well unless the drivers are crap. Of course you're going to look at benchmarks, but I don't think anyone, with any sense, or I can't think of any graphics card where the specs have been really good, but then the cards has just performed crap. There have been certainly some disappointing cards out there. The Gddr5 5000 series, for example, wasn't exactly as good as what expected. AMD's have had a couple as well, like the X800 series maybe wasn't as good as what people had hoped, because it did have the certain levels of DX support, smart shader support that maybe we expected at the time, but I don't ever think that I've seen a very high-end graphics card that just hasn't lived up to the specs that it should have. Maybe poor driver support, that's a great example, or even the Radeon 7990, which had some issues with driver updates that have just been released just recently, but still, that was mostly micro stuttering and so on. So I don't exactly understand how that's happening. I mean, sure, you're going to run benchmarks, but I don't run the benchmarks. I'm going to look at, other websites that are doing that for me. And once again, generally speaking, if you look at a graphics card, especially if it's based on the same family, that's the point that I think a lot of people are going to make, then it's like, it doesn't take a genius to realize that the 7950 is not going to run as fast as a 7970, for example, in AMD's case. And obviously, you could do things like overclock the graphics cards and so on, but you know what I mean. It just doesn't really make 100% sense to me. It's just a little bit confusing. Now, I'm not saying that Microsoft are lying. I'm just saying that some of the statements are just a little bit odd. I'm a little bit confused by them, to be honest. For example, balance is so key to real effective performance. It's been real nice on the Xbox One with Nick and his team. The system designed folks who've built a system where they've had opportunity to check the balance of the system and make tweaks accordingly. Did we do a good job when it comes to analysis and simulation a couple of years ago and guessing where games would be in terms of utilization? Did we make the right choice and decisions back then? And so raising the GPU clock as a result of going in and tweaking our balance. We knew we had some headroom. We didn't know what we wanted to do with that until we had real titles to test by. And how much do we increase the GPU by, and how much do we increase the CPU by? We had the headroom. And it's a glorious thing to have at a console launch. Normally, you're talking about having to downclock. We once had a lifetime opportunity to go in and pick up the spots where we want to improve the performance, and it was great to have launch titles that could used as a way to drive an informed decision on performance improvements we can get out of the headroom. Furthermore, they said that every one of the Xbox One's dev kits actually has 14 compute units. 2 of these CUs were reserved for redundancy and manufacturing, but we could go in and do the experiment. If we were actually at 14 CUs, what kind of performance benefit we have versus 12? And if we raise the GPU clock, what sort of performance advantage would we get? And we actually saw launch titles, we looked at a lot of the titles in depth, and we found that going for 14 CUs wasn't as effective as a 6.6 upclock that we did. Everybody knows from the internet that going to 14 CUs would have given us almost 70% more performance. But in terms of actual measured games, what actually ultimately counts, it was better engineering decision to raise the clocks. There are various benchmarks, there are various bottlenecks you have in the pipeline that can cause you not to get the performance you want from the design is out of balance. Increasing the frequency impacts the whole GPU, whereas adding CUs beefs up the shaders and ALUs. Right, by fixing the clock, not only do we increase the ALU performance, but we also increase our vertex rate, we increase our pixel rate, and ironically increase ESRAM bandwidth. But we also increase the performance in areas surrounding bottlenecks like draw calls, flowing through the pipeline, the performance of reading GPRs out of the GPR pool. The GPU is giantly complex. There are gazillions of areas in the pipeline that can have your bottlenecks in addition to just ALU and fetch performance, end quote for now. So I have some issues with this, as you'd expect. I understand why he's coming from, but here's the problem. When you're saying that, for their system, that, 2 extra compute units is better performance, basically them enabling the 2 extra CUs gives them better performance. I suspect that they are saying the balance on their system, because they're not trying to state this against PlayStation 4, because, for example, Guerrilla, who are behind Killzone on the PlayStation 4, have stated that there aren't any real bottlenecks on the PlayStation 4. So, here's the thing. People have already stated that there's a couple of issues. One, ROPS. There's less ROPS on the Xbox 360, on the Xbox One, and ROPS, of course, are responsible for ultimately rendering a lot of the stuff on screen. People are saying, well, is it possible that for you, because obviously increasing the clock speed and so on gives you more bandwidth and so on, is it possible that for them, because of the lack of ROPS, because of the lack of bandwidth from the DDR3 and ESRAM, obviously for them, increasing the clock speed did give them more ESRAM bandwidth as well, which is obviously a great thing. Is it possible that they just were bandwidth starved and they were ROP starved? In other words, they simply couldn't render the stuff fast enough anyway. And it's kind of a difficult thing to answer, really. So, I am about 25 minutes in now, and I'm only about halfway through the interview, and goodness knows I have a lot of thoughts on this so far that I've not even mentioned. So I'm going to go into a few of them now, because I want to get something up today. Okay. I think that we're a lot clearer, and it does alleviate some worries I had regarding ESRAM. It shows that yes, it's capable of simultaneous read and writes, because some people were questioning that. Some people felt that Microsoft were just using that as like spin or something like that, and I didn't really think that. I guessed that Microsoft weren't lying about that, because if they were, they'd been torn apart. So I didn't really expect that to happen. It also goes in to show you why they're choosing 204, because obviously they believe that 109 times 2 doesn't equal that. But they decided not to go with 218. They decided to go with 204 because obviously of conflicts between read and write and so on. And that makes sense. I respect that. I respect them being a little bit more accurate. They're saying that on their actual applications they're loading, they're getting about 150 gigabytes per second. I respect that. You know, they're giving fairly accurate numbers, I think. And speaking just from the memory perspective for a moment, I think that they've got a reasonable setup. I prefer the PlayStation 4 setup, because I think that from the perspective of developers, it's going to be easier. It will be easier, and I think that anyone who thinks differently, I just don't really see how, you know, the ESRAM is going to be as easy to develop for, because it's brainless. I'm sorry, I'm not saying that to insult developers, I'm not saying that to insult Sony, but it's like, you don't have to work to utilize any part of it. There's so little. It's like, let's assume that your game requires 3 gigs of RAM. It doesn't matter how you split that. It doesn't matter where that memory is. You don't have to do any memory management at all. So from the perspective of indies, they don't have to care. Is basically I'm saying. And from the perspective of AAA developers, whether you're dealing with a 2 gig game or whether you're dealing with a 6 gig in memory game, it doesn't matter what they do, because all of it has pretty much the same level of priority in terms of memory bandwidth. So I'm not exactly sure. I mean, I understand that they're saying that it feeds the CUs okay, and I'm not trying to tell them that they've made a stupid decision. I'm not trying to come across as one of those people who, you know, say that you're idiots or whatever. They obviously know what they're doing. They would not have put this thing together without a little bit of knowledge, but I don't think that it's a better solution. I think it's a solution. I think it's a solution that will work. I'm not sure if developers are gonna find it a hindrance in the future. I guess we'll just have to see. It's most likely, though, that the memory at the moment is actually more of a scratch pad than anything else, which tells us more than what it did. We'll go into that later, however, when I'm giving my final thoughts. But I'm more confident that the ESRAM is going to be okay. In regards to the compute power, though, in terms of the... I'm sorry, guys, my water bottle's crunching. In terms of raw compute power, though, I don't see it. I mean, they're saying that it's balanced around it, but they're not really answering a lot of the questions. Here's the thing. If developers, and we're talking about people who don't really care, they're not invested either way, and have said Microsoft is slower, then I'd have said, okay, you know, maybe they're not as slow as what, you know, we imagined them to be. But developers, not, you know, people on the internet, we're talking about actual proper games developers, are saying that it's 40 to 50% difference in speed. Now, obviously, this is really early, and Microsoft are trying their best to improve this stuff, but this isn't me saying this. This is what developers are saying, and so this is still an area where I would like Microsoft to clarify this. Because it's still a bit confusing to me. It's like, okay, well, I understand that you're saying your system is balanced, and I appreciate that, but it's not like the PlayStation 4 is unbalanced. There have been unbalanced systems designed in the past, without a question. The PlayStation 3 was a pain in the ass to develop for. The original PlayStation wasn't that great in terms of memory, it just didn't have enough. And there have been numerous other systems. I'm not going to bother to pick apart the whole universe of computing systems that just haven't been balanced. Even graphics cards on the PC just sometimes are just not balanced. They've not got enough memory bandwidth, for example. But you can tell that. You just look at the specifications. You say, okay, I kind of think this is going to be a bit of a problem. And then, of course, it does bear fruit. And, for example, the original GeForce cards, which were released way back when, you know, you looked at them and you thought to yourself, really? You're going to be using SDR-RAM? Are you sure? Are you positive on this? And they ended up using it for the first iteration. They did release DDR5 DDR, the original DDR, not DDR2, not DDR3, just DDR. And this is over SDR, which is the one that I was a bit confused over. And you could just tell the system, the poor little fella was just really bandwidth starved. It just was. It was just obvious. But it was obvious when they were designing the card that, that was going to be a trade-off. And this is saying that kind of went into the GeForce 2s. The MXs were notoriously bandwidth starved as well. Then, of course, GeForce 4s came out, and the MXs were a lot better. They had a really good memory controller, which was basically kind of like a GeForce GTS, a GeForce 2 GTS, an improvement over that, and they've improved them over time. My point being that you can kind of tell if something's not going to do as well as what you expect it to. And so developers, like I've used this example before, but the Call of Duty Ghosts, there have been rumors circulating around at E3 that they were getting the PS4 version up to 90 frames per second within just a couple of weeks. And this is at 1080p apparently. An Xbox One version, basically 4 or 5 times longer, and they're saying that it was going at, well, not even, it was just 15 frames a second or something like that? Yeah, I googled and yeah, I was right. 15 frames per second. And that's without optimization, I'd hasten to add, but still, that tells me that there was some type of bottleneck, or the code wasn't working well on that particular system. So I guess we're going to have to, wait. Now, there are a couple of other, there's quite a lot that I've not covered, but this video is already 32 minutes long, and quite frankly, people they don't really want me to put out like an hour-long video, so I've got a lot of stuff to research as well before my final thoughts. It's probably going to be another 1 to 2 parts extra on top of this. So anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed it. I'm going to be doing some research over the next day or so, and I'm going to be giving more thoughts on this, because it's just another example that I've been saying for a while. It gives a lot of information, but it doesn't answer some of the questions. Anyway, I'm going to going, so hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.